All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Victory Over Vices podcast, brought to you commercial free by addictionhelp.com. I am your host, Dan Hauser, and today we are going to spend some time talking about Miami Dolphins head coach Mike McDaniel. We already know all about his great wins he has had on the field in his short tenure with the team, but today we're going to talk about quite arguably his most important victory in life, and that was something that came off the field when he was victorious over his struggles with mental health and addiction. So without further ado, let's get right into the show. All right, so we're going to talk about a pretty special topic to me today. As you can see, Dolphins hat on, big Dolphins fan here. Mike McDaniel, our new mad genius of a coach who has brought so much prosperity and so much hope to the South Florida culture down here, which is something we have been in desperate need for with our NFL team as of late. The Dolphins, once again this year, they find themselves thick in the conversation of one of the best teams in the NFL. They are through the first 6 weeks of the season, they are putting up Madden-like numbers. In case you haven't been paying attention, they are on pace right now offensively to be the most prolific offense in NFL history, which is something pretty big. Even on the defensive side of the ball, where they've been struggling as of late, they've been doing enough to keep themselves in games. And Jalen Ramsey is on his way back, which should do wonders for the defense. However, as much as I could just sit here and gush all day about the Dolphins and how great they've been this year, I want to talk a little bit about their coach, Mike McDaniel. So for those of you who don't know, over the years, you have probably seen that graphic if you watch NFL games regularly of the Washington Redskins coaching staff from about 5 or 6 years ago. It had Mike McDaniel on the staff. It had Sean McVay on the staff, Kyle Shanahan, and Matt LaFleur, amongst many others. But those are the big key ones that they always talk about because those are the big ones that have now become NFL coaches and successful NFL coaches. So specifically, when we talk about Mike McDaniel, we have seen his success on the field. He has obviously been a Kyle Shanahan protege. He's kind of followed him around everywhere he's gone and been successful everywhere he's gone. And that's just one aspect of what we've seen him on the field. Off the field has been a very different story. While he did show successes in the coaching ranks, off the field, Mike McDaniel struggled for many, many years battling alcoholism, and then later, as he came to find out, it was as a result of his depression. And so just a quick little backstory of how this all kind of came about, just to look at some quick notes I've got here. So we like I mentioned, we know about the stint in Washington, but prior to that, we go all the way back to the 2006 season when he gets first hired by the Houston Texans and Coach Gary Kubiak. And so during his time with the Houston Texans, as he admits, as we'll talk about here a little more later, he admits to drinking a lot. He would go out a lot at night drinking. And so there would be times where in the morning he would be late for his coaches' meetings. Gary Kubiak, as he talks about as well, was a very structured coach. 6 a.m. on the dot, you're expected to be there. If you weren't there at 6 a.m., he'd be calling your phone looking for where you were. And so, as Mike McDaniel even put it at the time, he was fired for what he perceived to be being late to meetings. Now, through reflection and through his time in rehab, he learned he was late to meetings because of his drinking. But so after he gets fired by Houston, which he admits was his dream job at the time, because you have to understand, to be a coach in the NFL, it's a very, very closed-off system. It's a very closed-off system in all professional sports, but particularly the NFL. It's why every year we see the same 4 or 5 names for vacancies, whether they're for head coaches, defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator, and they're usually retreads. So in the case of Mike McDaniel, he didn't have, like Kyle Shanahan had the last name of Mike Shanahan. You know, you have people that come up because they have family members that are able to kind of help bring them in. Mike McDaniel didn't have that. He was a ball boy for the Denver Broncos. That was basically his what he had done in the past as far as being on an NFL sideline. So at the time he thinks he loses his dream job, he is out of the league for 856 days, I believe was the number. And we'll get back to that number here very, very shortly, because that number holds a lot of significance. And so while he was out of the league, 865 days. So while he's out of the league, he goes and coaches in the now defunct UFL. And so, whether it was for him or to show that he could get back in the league with other teams, he went and did that. Eventually, then after that stint in the UFL, the NFL came calling again, and he gets that Washington job that everyone knows about because we talked about all those big head coaches that have come out of there. So he goes to Washington. From there he goes to Cleveland before he ends up in San Francisco. Or I'm sorry, he goes from Washington, then to Cleveland, then to Atlanta before eventually ending up in San Francisco where he was before the Dolphins hired him. But even during those stops, there were stories and reports that came out, empty bottles in the facility when he was in Cleveland because he would sit in his office at night and drink while he was there. There were times when he had alcohol on his breath when he was coaching in Atlanta. And it was finally in Atlanta. It's still, mind you, at this point, he's still only just 32 years old. He gets approached by coworkers of his who basically call him out on it. And so at that point is when he decides to go into rehab and get help. And as he tells it, the last drink he ever took was on January 4th, 2016. So he spends 3 weeks in a treatment facility. It was at that point where he kind of realized, as many do in treatment, that kind of the reasons behind their drinking. He learned at that point it was depression. And he also learned at that point too, and it's interesting, and we're going to touch on this more in detail in a little bit too, because this is particularly interesting that he admits to, and it's understandable. He is on the same sideline in the same coaching room, as we mentioned, Kyle Shanahan, Matt LaFleur, Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan's father, Mike Shanahan. So he's seeing all these guys around him almost having instant success, and he wasn't. And so in his mind, he was wondering if he was a failure because he wasn't climbing the ranks quite as quickly as these other coaches that were on his sideline. So fast forwarding, as we talked about, to, he gets that job in San Francisco, links back up with Kyle Shanahan again. The Dolphins pluck him out in 2022, name him their 14th head coach in franchise history. And so far, obviously, it's been all success for Mike McDaniel. Made the playoffs last year in his first season without star quarterback Tua Tagovailoa for a good chunk of the season. This year, like we mentioned, through 6 weeks, they are 5-1. They are second in the AFC right now, behind only Kansas City, and they're quickly being viewed as a very much a Super Bowl contender. So that's kind of the backstory as far as Mike McDaniel's goes. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about Mike McDaniel's tremendous story with. Be right back. Welcome back to the show. I am so beyond excited for, as you can see, the guest that I have with me today. That, as for those of you who may not recognize him, is ChrisCarberg. He is the co-founder of addictionhelp.com. He is the reason why this podcast exists today. And the reason why I'm so particularly excited to talk to him today is because him and I are such massive football fans. And we have had some opportunities to talk football off the air. We have never had an opportunity yet to talk football on the air because we haven't obviously had a sports podcast to warrant doing that. So now that we have the Victory Over Vices podcast, immediately I'm like, Chris, you got to come on. We got to talk some football. This Mike McDaniel story is amazing. And so with that, Chris, thank you so much for coming on with me today. This is truly a treat.
Yeah, no, it's an honor for me. And like you said, any chance to where we get to talk football, we get to talk about the things that, that matter to us here with addiction recovery, but the intersection of sports, it's our life. I come from a family where that's really important. And so just to get to talk about this, I will say that as a New York Jets fan, it's encoded in my DNA to hate anything Miami Dolphins. And yet I like Mike McDaniel and I struggle with that daily. But when you get to hear his story, there's something about people, those of us who are in recovery, I don't know, there's something like a sixth sense, and you can kind of feel that with certain people of like, there's something about that person. And I have felt that way about Mike McDaniel, and I thought his story was so worth telling, and I'm glad we're able to tell it here.
Yeah, but you know what? That just goes to show you how motivational stories like this involving recovery and addiction and mental health can truly transcend sports, our sports fandom, our allegiances, because as you said yourself, you are a diehard. If you cut yourself open, not if you were to be cut open right now, you'd be bleeding green. And yet here we are talking about a
Completely.
Dolphins coach in a positive light. So that just goes to show how stories
Yep.
like this that are truly inspirational can cut through even the deepest and harshest of rivalries. So
Miracles can happen. Miracles can happen.
Exactly. So right out of the gate, Chris, and you mentioned off the top, you are somebody who also is in recovery. So this is something I wanted to talk about right off the top, because you and I have actually had conversations about this in the previous iteration when we were doing the Addiction Help podcast. We've had just conversations in life about it, and I try to hammer this point home whenever I can. You know, as a society, we're doing much better, but I think there's still growth as far as these preconceived notions and stereotypes about your quote unquote average addict, or you're someone, the person who struggles with mental health. And whether you like it or not, a lot of people have just this vision in their head of who and what an addict looks like. And if I had to guess, I'm guessing that what that vision looks like in their head is not what Mike McDaniel looks like, because to hear him speak, to hear about his story, to see what he has done, he's a genius. First off, when it comes to football, he has had success even despite his alcoholism. As we learned from him sharing his story, he was essentially a functioning alcoholic for many, many years. Yeah, what happened in Houston happened, but to hear him tell it himself at the time, he just was like, okay, well, I got fired because I was late to some meetings, not because I was drinking. And then you continue to drink in Cleveland. You continue to drink in Atlanta, obviously, until when he was in Atlanta, finally, he was able to get some help. So it's just a reminder right out of the gate to everyone that addiction and mental health struggles, they do not care what you look like. They do not care what your job is. They do not care how old you are. They do not care how much money you make. They will inflict even the best of us. So right out of the gate, I think that's an important topic to bring up, because you look at someone like him and you say, okay, but he's so good and he's been so successful. How could he have had this happen to him? So right out of the gate, I think that's an important topic. And I think it's one that you can very much uniquely speak to as well, given your history as well.
Yeah, no, and I think when I look at Mike McDaniel, I see tremendous intellect. I see kind of an incredible understanding of the game. And sometimes we confuse, whether someone is bright and intellectual with whether they can battle these things. And the reality, like you said, is that it affects everybody in some form or fashion. Whether you're the person who has the affliction and you're dealing with it, or you're a family member, you're dealing with it in some way. And when we look at these very, very high performing people, it can feel sometimes just like, that's not what I was expecting. That was not the as you said, the picture of what I expected. I expected something and someone who didn't have their life going in the right direction. And then I would also, I think a lot of people question, why would you destroy your life if it's going in the right direction? And I think that points to the actual issue of addiction, that this is not, this, in many cases, when we talk about it as a disease, we tend to honestly be willing to almost spike our life. We will ruin good things, and it really oftentimes is through no fault of your own. Like, I understand putting a pill in your mouth, putting a drink in your mouth, that is what you can control. However, the compulsion toward it is overwhelming. And so when we talk about things like people being in recovery saying, I was powerless over this, it doesn't mean you're powerless entirely. It means you're powerless in the presence of that. And over time, like, if I do this, something changes. And Dr. Hoffman, who's our other co-founder, he's told us that this is a brain disease. This is a brain disorder. And Dr. Hoffman was the team doctor for the Orlando Magic for 12 years. So this is not a guy who doesn't appreciate or understand sports. But what we're seeing now is, we look at somebody who has it all together, apparently, and we say, well, either A, why would you throw it all away? Or B, like, maybe he really isn't addicted. Maybe it's not that thing. And what we see with Mike McDaniel is all the signs of alcohol, use disorder. He was exhibiting them, and he was exhibiting them for a while in conjunction with, we do it a lot of times because we want to try and stop something, or we want to try and treat something and cope it. In his case, like we said, depressive issues, alcohol is a depressant, like putting depressant on depression is like doubling down. And so the next thing you are twice as deep, downward as you were before. So it is getting better that we're talking about these things. Like, we're seeing, I saw what happened with Max Crosby now they're asking him to change his face mask because he wanted to use the triangle that is used in Alcoholics Anonymous. People are talking about it, at least. And that's a good thing, but we do have a ways to go, and to understand a guy like Mike McDaniel, I think you really have to kind of delve into his history, his background, and what led him down this path. This is a high stakes game. And in the NFL, a lot of times you only get one shot. One big mess up, and you're going to be relegated to never having that chance again. So, I'm inspired by Mike McDaniel's story. I also am very impressed with him as a person. I think he has something that I noticed that people in recovery have a lot, which strangely is a killer instinct. And that is one of the ways you get sober. You have to have a killer instinct, to want to stop this and to put your life on the right track. And I can see it on the field. I can see how he coaches with it. And it can look sometimes like you go from switching from trying to harm yourself to like trying to harm enemies, or whatever it is you're trying to achieve. You can channel that thing, but we always start in addiction with ourselves. So it's an amazing story. Seeing his life profile, the things he's achieving are incredible. And it's moving. It's very, very moving stuff.
A couple things too, the point that interested me too, and you kind of touched on him a little bit. Obviously, the second chance thing. He has clearly made the most of his second chance, but also, I think something that we have seen as well from him, and this may just be something front facing, we don't know for sure, because also it's interesting to note too that whether athletes, celebrities, all these front facing people that are constantly out in the public eye, it's important to know too, we think that we know these people and we think that we know their lives. And this story that Mike McDaniel is now sharing just goes to show that we really don't know anything about these people, that we think that we know everything about them. So we can hold them to the standard because we think that we know them. We don't really know them at all. But something interesting with Mike McDaniel too, is I think that his journey through life has given him a perspective that has allowed him to, I guess you could almost say, break the mold when it comes to coaching, because for so much of our lives, it's been ingrained that, like, if you're a coach, you have to be super hard and you have to yell at everyone and you have to just, pound them in and almost insult them and whatnot. And I think what we're seeing with Mike McDaniel is he's gone the exact opposite way. He is trying to find, even if something bad happens, he is trying to find that one little positive nugget that he can highlight before going into the negative stuff. And he talked about it when he sat down with Jeff Darlington to do the NFL Sunday morning show, I believe it was. When the first time he met Tua, he immediately pulled up, I think they said something like 700 plays that Tua did well on. Immediately, right out of the gate. So instead of just coming in and saying, okay, this is every aspect of where you suck, it was, hey, here are 700 times where you were amazing. And so how can we replicate that? And so I think that's also really refreshing to see, because once again, not just for Mike McDaniel, but in this age where we focus more on a player's mental health as well too. Obviously, if you're constantly getting told you suck and you're getting yelled at by your coach, it takes a toll on you mentally. But if you can find this approach that Mike McDaniel has seemed to find, where obviously he's coaching these guys, and obviously he's finding where they messed up so he can fix that, but he's also making a point to highlight, well, here's everything good you also did too. And so that obviously, not just for his own mental health, but for his players' mental health, that's got to be so incredibly refreshing. And I think that's another reason why we're seeing the Dolphins so successful on the field, because they're playing for a guy who genuinely and legitimately wants to see them succeed, not for the advancement of his own career, but for the advancement of their career as well.
The players, and you bring up a great point about we have this picture in our head of what a coach has to be, and whether they are, whether they're just tough and they're yelling and screaming and cursing you out, and that, let me tell you, that is a percentage of the coaches. Then you have ones who are, I would say, energetic and positive, and those are a percentage of the coaches. Pete Carroll's an example. Pete Carroll has always been Pete Carroll. I was a ball boy with the Jets when Pete Carroll was the head coach, and it was again, it was like a dream summer. Like the energy, the feel, everything was so great. So you have these guys who are tough. I'm referencing Jets coaches, obviously, but like, then you have these guys who are very cerebral. And offensive coaches have always had a little bit of a different feel to them. I think that the traditional coach that we're used to is a defensive minded coach, which is an attack defensive coach. And it's a kind of a caricature that we've grown to know. What matters most to the players, I think, is that you're genuine. The fact is that there have been coaches that have a whiz kid sort of feel to them, like McDaniel, but you could tell they weren't genuine, or it wasn't really who they were. And I think the players can see through that every single time. And when you look also at when he came in, when we talk about his second chances, he will look at someone like Tua and, to come in and say, a lot of times people come in and they're saying they're not going to be, that's not my quarterback. That's not going to be my guy. I'm going to bring my own person to do this. Here's how we're going to do it. He essentially has given Tua in some ways a second chance also, because how fast it is that people make up their mind with a young quarterback. You don't have time to allow someone to grow. So he is, I think he's made the most of his second chance. And, it's interesting also because when he was approached at, I was looking back into like the coaches that he worked with. Again, he worked with Shanahan, Kubiak, Kyle Shanahan, Tom Sula, Chip Kelly, McVay, Dan Quinn, and Robert Saleh. And Dan Quinn, I know he was one of the folks at the Falcons who was involved in his intervention. And Dan Quinn, Dan Quinn was my coach at Hofstra football camp, around the same time frame when Pete Carroll was there. And so I watched that guy grow, and he was a leader and a great man from that time. But what's amazing is a lot of people saw what was going on with him, but nobody really did anything until that point. And he goes to rehab, McDaniel. And I always find these things interesting because right around that time, it's the right after the new year, right? It's Super Bowl 50, and the team that is playing in it, it's Panthers versus the Broncos. Broncos win. That was McDaniel's team growing up. It's just kind of interesting to me. Like he kind of got sober, got to see, even though it wasn't his team he was coaching for, but he got to see his childhood favorite team win the Super Bowl again with Peyton. But then you go, what's coming up, right? Which was, we had the 28-3 game, with the Falcons, and I can't remember if he was still there at the time for it. But I mean, again, it was I just thought it was kind of cool that, he gets sober. And then his childhood team wins the Super Bowl, even though it wasn't his team at the time. It's like, you got to look for those little moments, here and there. And I feel like there is something very genuine about him. He is different. But I think it's, again, genuine. There's something very unique about it. And as long as it's genuine, I think players will always respond. It's usually when they can sense that, when someone's not being genuine, so it's alcohol. When I think of alcohol in terms of how you can be at the top of your game and it can really take you down. One of the problems is that it's often masked as blowing off steam, especially when you're talking about a high testosterone situation like a football team, right? Where it's kind of encouraged. And so what can happen is somebody who battles, alcohol use disorder or alcoholism, they're going to be in that, they're going to fall through the cracks. People are all going to get drunk together sometimes. And then everyone goes home and sobers up and is like, okay, well, I'm going to move on with my life. I'm not going to, the person who's an alcoholic, they go home and nobody thinks that they're going through something different at that point. And so when you're in something that's high pressure like sports, it is, it's just something I think that you're opened up to very quickly. But to think that, it took until that time with the Falcons that somebody said something to him and really tells you also that it's a hard discussion to have with anyone in the NFL, because some people will miss it. Some of his coaches probably missed it. But it took a coach who cared, and I know Dan Quinn cares a lot. One of the most caring and compassionate and awesome guys, while also like motivating you. It's awesome that we see that kind of redemption arc that starts there, then moves to the 49ers and now to the Dolphins. So, and again, as a Jets fan, I can't deny what he's done there. It's legitimate. And yeah, so it's an amazing thing for sure.
You mentioned Tua. This is another thing that I find interesting too, and I almost can't help but wonder if McDaniel sees a little bit of himself in Tua, because for those of you who may not be football fans, for those of you who may not have followed the Dolphins closely, before Mike McDaniel got there, the Dolphins essentially had given up on Tua already. Brian Flores, the previous coach, had benched him multiple times the prior season for Ryan Fitzpatrick, who, and not there's anything wrong with Fitzpatrick. He won the Dolphins plenty of games coming in a relief, but when you have that quarterback of the future there, you're not really good. You wouldn't really expect him to be benched for the old veteran. The old veteran's supposed to be there to talk to him on the sidelines, work with him in the QB room, work with him during practice, not to go in relief for a non-injury related scenario. So, the Dolphins basically had given up on him. And then you give McDaniel comes in and immediately is like, nah, Tua is my guy. So I almost can't help but wonder. And once again, the only one who would really know the answer to this question would be Mike McDaniel. But I do wonder if he saw a little bit of himself in Tua from the standpoint of that, Tua had kind of been overlooked. They kind of been given up on. They were kind of ready to just be like, okay, whatever, move on or whatever. And then, he comes in and says, no. Tua's my guy. I can get something out of him, because somebody didn't just say, no, to me. Like you said, Dan Quinn didn't just say, no, get out of here to me. He came to me and said, you're my guy. Let's make this work. And so you almost feel like that's kind of now what McDaniel has done with Tua.
That's one of the reasons why the people in recovery make great coaches, and they make, we've talked about them being sponsors, before. We've talked to them about being coaches though, and leaders. One of the reasons why people like myself, even who are addicts in recovery, make great leaders are because we give people second chances who deserve it. We don't write people off immediately. We look to how can we create a scenario that fits for this person. And I think that's one of the things that people don't understand, is that it's not a weakness that makes somebody, an alcoholic or battling that stuff. It can be flipped inside out, and it can be turned into a strength. And so when he came in there, instead of, I've seen, how many times have you seen coaches come in and they just clear it out? They're like, nope, I don't want to use anybody from the last regime because I don't want to touch it. I don't want it tied to me. It's a lot harder to rehabilitate someone.
We saw it happen in Arizona with Kyler Murray.
Oh, completely.
I'm drawing a blank on who the quarterback was the year before, but it was a first round pick. The new coach comes in. He says,
Josh Rosen.
I want my own guy. Josh Rosen, thank you. Yeah. New coach comes in, says, get out of here, Rosen. I want to bring in my own guy. And then the next year, immediately with the first round pick again, they take another quarterback in Kyler Murray. So we've seen it happen as recently as a couple of years ago. Absolutely. It happens more times than not that's how it works. And so I also think that's one of the things that players respect. They want to see that, because what we expect of players is that they can take their athletic talent and do something more with it. If they're injured, we expect them to find a way to make it work. We expect them to play through injuries, like things like that.
The same is not expected oftentimes of coaches. They'll say, well, it's not my guy, it's not my team, it's not this. What it really is like he saw an opportunity there to craft something around Tua, and I think he did that. And I think that, again, that's what makes addicts and people in recovery incredible leaders, is that they don't just view people as a one-time commodity. They can see beyond this screw up. They can start to see down the field and say, if I can reform this, this, and this, I can get that person to where they were before they started making those bad decisions. And then the key is that you have people around you who give you that chance and then empower you to do it, to have that. But I think that's one of the misnomers, is that addicts and people in recovery are weak, and they are just, this dude is not weak. I'm telling you, he's himself. He has a killer instinct. He has a football killer instinct. I want to clarify that, but he has, it's not about, again, he has something to him that is genuinely his, and people can feel it. He is opening up opportunities for different players to come and have their second phase of their life. The question about Tyreek Hill, was he going? I mean, we all knew he was insanely talented with what he did with Mahomes. He comes to Miami. The question is, if you don't have a guy with a rocket arm, can you make use of a guy like Tyreek? Is it going to be the same explosiveness? And the reality is, he comes to Miami, different system, different style of play, excels again. And you can see why someone like Jalen Ramsey wants that opportunity. You can see why people are looking to come here, because he also does it in a way that is, I think, again, genuine. Players, whether they are intellectual or not, can smell bull crap a mile away. They can see through coaches faster than any other like corporate type I've ever seen. They can smell whether you're real or not, and whether you can lead them to the promised land. So it's, he's a prototypical. He's no different than a lot of people out there who have battled alcoholism, have battled depression, have battled these things. And by the way, he's going to battle these things for the rest of his life. He's battling it right now at the top of the hill. He had to battle it when they lost games in the past. When he was in, just to look at my notes there for a sec, he coached, in 3 of the past 6 NFC championship games and 2 Super Bowls before the Miami Dolphins. He experienced loss, he experienced winning, but the thing is that as a coach, he is going to have to cope with this stuff through the rest of his life, and to find a way to not fall back on bad habits. He's at the top right now, and we have seen. I mean, look, you know how it is in the NFL. People are at the top, and they are the best. And then 2 weeks later, 2 weeks later, it's like everyone's calling for their head, and they're flying. They're flying planes with stickers saying like, hey,
fire this guy,
fire.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's but I think that he is positioned to be able to do this successfully, because he's gone through that. He has been, having the highs and the lows that can help you when you're trying to determine what your future is going to look like and how you cope.
You mentioned Tyreek Hill and Jalen Ramsey. He's about to, whether it's this week or next week or whenever he finally gets on the field, he's about to give Chase Claypool his 3rd chance now, because he had his issues in Pittsburgh, and then got traded to Chicago, and then he had his problems in Chicago,
mm-hmm.
who now gave him to Miami. So he's about to give Chase Claypool a 3rd opportunity. And if Claypool can even be half of the wide receiver he was in Pittsburgh,
mm-hmm.
you want to talk about the rich getting richer from an offensive standpoint. He's going to be like wide receiver number 8 once he finally gets on the field.
I know.
So it's
his
crazy.
His depth on there. Yeah.
And
I was going to mention, about Bill Belichick did the same thing though.
Yeah.
Bill Belichick,
he took everybody.
Love him or again.
Yeah.
And he had ones where it was an Albert Hainsworth and it didn't work out. Okay. But he
Randy
also
Moss.
took the guys who, then yeah, you have a Randy Moss who
yeah.
everyone is saying is like, he's not going to be able to work in that system. It's not going to be able to deal with the Patriot way. He absolutely did. He was fine.
And
He
won a
was
Super
one of
Bowl.
the greats in that. Yeah, did he win? I don't think he won that season. I
think that might have been the season where they won 16-0 and lost. But
that was
still,
the
he
one.
had a lot of success.
They were so close.
He had plenty of success.
Oh, he was extraordinary. Extraordinary. But you're right. That's the thing. I think the coaches that can reform are extremely valuable because what it means is that they can take whatever you have and they can find a way to make it work, within there, instead of it being just their system. I've seen, listen, you know how it is. I've seen the coaches who say, this is my system. I want my exact type of player to run my exact type of thing. We both dealt with Adam Gase in that. Yeah. Adam, from all accounts, Adam is one of the from all I've heard of people
very nice
who know
human
him,
being
and one of the geniuses of understanding football. But there's also a rigidity there and possibly an inability to be able to morph. And that's what we see a lot with these cerebral types. And because McDaniel is quiet, we kind of put him in that same camp as like I would say a Gase or a Mike Martz, even like, these kind of cerebral types. I think he has a defensive coach's mindset of attack. But it's channeled through this other thing, this other version of himself. And I just think he is doing something extraordinary in Miami, and I think it's legitimate.
Really quick, before we go on to the next topic, I just want to quick aside. I want to share a personal story. You mentioned about how, especially those in recovery, they make a point to try to find the best in people and then figure out the best way to utilize that. I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but just a little behind the scenes. You and I have been in a business relationship now for about 2 years. Mm-hmm. And we have seen that relationship evolve plenty. When you first brought me in, it was to write content for addictionhelp.com. And then we pivoted to doing blog stuff. And then you were like, hey, look, I think that you could be really successful and do a really good job on the audio side of things and creating a podcast. And you sat there and worked with me and formulated. And at first it was the Addiction Help podcast. Now it's this Victory Over Vices podcast. There are so many times in my life and so many people that I've worked with and worked for who they bring you in for one thing and maybe it's not working out the best that first time around. And it's just, okay, we're going to move our separate ways. It just didn't work. But you instead were like, there's something here. We just got to figure out where we can maximize your talents and your abilities to do it because there's something here. We just got to figure out the best way to utilize it. And so like Mike McDaniel with Tua, I think you with me, you're like, okay, listen, I'm not just going to say, all right, well, it didn't work. See you later. Like there's something here. We just need to figure out what that is. And I think that, the podcasting side of things, and this has been great so far. So hopefully I didn't embarrass you too much on that one, but I'm honored. I'm honored. That's an example of kind of what you were talking about with how McDaniel is with Tua. I think that you and I have shared a similar dynamic over the last year and a half, I would say as well.
Oh, I completely agree. And I'm so glad you bring that up because, this is a good example because I know you to be a high character person, a good person, a hardworking person. Those traits are in and of themselves extraordinarily valuable. And so the question then becomes, are they in the right position to succeed? And I think that's where you begin to see people they're not just, I just don't believe this concept that you just, I've always told you, I believe God puts people in my life for a reason, and he ignites fires in me to see them achieve their potential. And that's the thing. And it does, here's the hard part though. It takes having hard discussions and saying, I don't think this thing's working, but realizing, that it's because we care. It's because we want the best for someone. And I think that a coach is no different. I have a feeling that he can have a hard conversation with Tua and Tua can hear it the way he needs to hear it. And I think all the players can take criticism because they know it's coming from a place of wanting you to get better. They want to put you in position. Some coaches, that's not what it's about. It's about just hitting you, putting you down, saying like, I'm going to store you in the closet till we trade you. It's like that's my grandpa always used to say, you're not, when players would say that people were being tough to them. When my grandpa was a doctor, team doctor for the New York Jets, he would say when players would tell him, that they're, so and so is being really tough on me. And he says, if they're being nice to you, you're being cut or traded. It's the ones that a lot of times when they're tough on you, that they're trying to reform you, they're trying to build you. And I think the great coaches and the great leaders see human beings as unique and interesting and special, and they see someone's talent, they see their potential, and I wanted a hand in making, because I like we were talking on the phone one day, and so much is done through email now, and we talk, and I was talking to you and I'm just listening to your voice and I'm going, this dude has such a great voice. And I'm like, he does, and he can explain things and he has such energy. It's about finding the right spot for people and building around them, as opposed to just saying, here's my system, you either fit in it or you don't. To me, that's boring. I want to be pushed the same way. And so I do think it's a great example. And I do think I think players can feel that, and they will play hard for you. You work your butt off on this stuff. And it's not because of a fear thing, like it's because that I care, you want to help the whole company succeed. Like all of those things play into it after the fact. The same thing happens with a coach. It after a while, it's not just about the job. It is about the people. And I think that's what we're always trying to do, is to try and elevate people to the best situation they can possibly be in.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we are running up against the clock here, but there is one more interesting part of the story that I wanted to bring up and get your thoughts on, and that was the number 865. And so in the piece, McDaniel has an index card stapled above his computer in his office with that number 865 on it, and that signifies the number of days he was out of the NFL after he got fired in Houston. And so it's something that he looks at daily. It's a daily reminder to him of not just where he was in his life, but how far he has come. I personally think that's a really cool thing that he has and he looks at every day. Chris, what were your thoughts on that when you first learned about that 865 number? Because quite frankly, that was when we first had this conversation about this Mike McDaniel story, it was actually centered around that 865 number. So what is that? What is the significance of him doing that to you specifically? Because that was the first thing you shared with me about this whole story.
Yeah, no, I think so. When you get sober and you change your life, and or you're going through something, you find these markers, these things that help you remember where you've been. And 865 days for him, that's a long span of time to be away. And what it does is it reminds you of the valleys that you've been in. When I got sober, for instance, my dad gave me a can of Goya beans, which meant get off your ass and go to a meeting, go do something today. I had a can of Goya beans on my shelf for years. And I still have that very one from 18 years ago, which is pretty gross, I guess. I don't know if it goes bad. But what I think was what is special about it is that he definitely is memorializing when that thing occurred, what he dealt with. And that's what's going to give him the perspective that if things go south, if their quarterback gets hurt, if Tua goes down and something changes, he has to be prepared to cope with that. And by remembering those places, it also means, by the way, he survived the 865. Sometimes we go back into the 865. There's no promises that he won't go back into it. And so that my thought is, he is in a place though where he can cope if he ever, God forbid he ever does it, but that happens to every coach. I mean, they're ready to fire Belichick. I mean, like sometimes it sounds like, who knows if that's true, but you know what I'm saying? It's remembering that you can get out of the hole again. And of course, we say with addiction, you don't want to choose to go back into that. But if the 865 was him being out of the league, right? that was the time frame of him having to cope with not being in his beloved NFL. Different than like saying going back into your addiction. What it means is that he can deal with this again if it ever comes up. He's got the coping skills. He's going to be strong enough because he hasn't forgotten how he got out of it in the first place.
All right. Agreed too. All right, that'll do it for today's show. Thank you so much to Chris for joining me. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube if you're watching us over there on YouTube. And while you're there, please like, subscribe, rate, review, whatever you want to call it. Another great show today. With today's conversation, though, of course, about alcoholism, depression, and everything involving addiction, it is important to remind everyone out there that it is okay not to be okay, and there are people out there that genuinely do want to help you. Mm-hmm. And if you or a loved one are struggling with substance abuse, addiction, or mental health, please check us out over at addictionhelp.com. Everyone over there is doing amazing work, great resource pages, great information as far as the next steps to get you or your loved one the help that you need. But that'll do it for today's show. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today, and we will chat with you guys again next week. Have a great week, everybody.